Okay, it is 1:02, so we're going to get our meeting started here. My name is Ian Campbell. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Vice President of Operations at PACICC. I am the staff lead for the Risk Officers Forum, and I'm your moderator for this afternoon's Risk Officers Forum meeting. So welcome, everybody, and welcome if this is your first time joining us for one of these meetings. We're very excited about this afternoon's agenda. It's a very interesting subject matter and some very engaging speakers. I want to thank my colleague, Danica Hall, Operations Manager. She's behind the scenes and is going to be working the slide decks today and making sure that everything runs smoothly. So thank you, Danica, for that. If you're a regular Risk Officers Forum event attendee, you'll notice my background is different today. I'm still dealing with the office flood from September and hope to have that resolved shortly. And the bookcase, I can assure you that every one of these books I have colored myself. So just to let you know that. So Danica, now if we could put up the slide, perfect, the agenda for today. So we'll begin with some housekeeping items, then we'll move to a welcome to our CEO, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker, who's going to be addressing the issue of climate change. The second hour of discussion is devoted to space weather phenomena, and our third hour is an industry panel talking about the OSFI Risk Management Seminar agenda items from yesterday afternoon's meeting. And finally, we will flag 2022 Risk Officers Forum event dates for you and talk about the satisfaction survey that you're going to receive tomorrow. So in terms of housekeeping items, you're very familiar now in this COVID world with Microsoft Teams. You know the ground rules to make this a successful meeting. In your taskbar, you see the little hand. We want to make this a very interactive and participative meeting and talk about issues as they come up. When it's fresh in your head, please put your hand up. You'll be recognized. We'll ask you to turn on your video, turn on your audio, and you can pose your question or make your comment. And we have let our speakers know that they can be receiving comments throughout their presentations. In terms of antitrust compliance, the Competition Act is in full force throughout the meeting. If you have any questions, generally speaking, the answer is no. There's to be no approaches to business strategies, no common claims adjusting practices, no discussion of scopes of coverage, resolution of mixed claims, and/or management of third-party vendors and service providers. Generally speaking, we don't record our Risk Officers Forum meetings. We do, obviously, with the webinars, those are posted on our website, but we do like to put on the CEO speeches, the keynote speeches. They are always entertaining and enlightening. So the first 2 hours of today's broadcast are going to be recorded. So we're going to, the discussion on climate change and also the discussion on space weather phenomena will be recorded. So if you have a colleague that wasn't able to join us here today, they will see that in due course. And I guess now we'll move to opening remarks, introductory remarks from our President and CEO, Alistair Campbell. And Alistair is going to introduce our keynote speaker. So Alistair, let me throw the mic over to you.
Hi, everyone. And I hope you can hear me clearly. It's a pleasure to see so many folks still fully engaged at this time of the year, a particularly hectic one. So I will not go on for too long because we have three really fantastic topics here. But I have spent the last day and a half listening in on the IAIS annual sessions where they're talking about what is troubling and disturbing and worrying the global insurance supervisors community. And then yesterday afternoon, I sat in on the OSFI risk management event where they shared a extraordinarily long list of #1 priorities for what's uppermost on their mind. And so I think the panel discussion we're having later this afternoon is going to be a real highlight. There were a couple highlights for the PACICC year. So just quickly, we did publish our tipping point research paper in the spring that updated our systemic risk model. And we've had, I think, meaningful impact in the public dialogue and the discussions in Ottawa about getting the federal backstop mechanism we so desperately need as a country. I think we also engaged the industry quite nicely. I want to thank all of you who got tasked with filling out one of the two meaningful surveys we distributed this year, one on the idea of PACICC acquiring some reinsurance, and the other on our enterprise risk management survey. The feedback from both was meaningful and incredibly useful for our board. And so that's much appreciated. The last focus area for us this year was contingency planning. So we've done a ton of work we can't tell you much about, but we're in the middle of a desktop simulation of what happens if one of our members gets in trouble with OSFI. And they're learning a ton and we're learning a ton. And so if and when the worst case materializes, we will be ready. Just getting to our keynote speaker, I'm thrilled that Jason Storah is here today. He's a reformed chief risk officer. And so at some point in his life, he had the glamorous role many of you do. And then for some reason, he got to be a CEO instead. Almost certainly merit, I'm guessing. But some days I suspect he feels like he's still the chief risk officer. I had a CEO job of an insurance company for a decade, and it is quite a lot of work. And one of the most challenging parts of that kind of job is being asked to serve on industry groups as well and finding the time to do it. And so I am particularly pleased that Jason is here. One, because he has put tremendous effort into his role at Aviva. Two, because he has put tremendous effort into his role as an industry leader. And he is on the board of IBC, as I noticed in his bio, but what he mysteriously left out, he's on the board of PACICC. And that requires a degree of real commitment and bravery. And we are deeply grateful that industry leaders like Jason choose to step up and support the infrastructure of the industry and ensure that the strategic thinking that is required for key elements of our infrastructure, we get the right inputs. And so I'm just really happy that Jason is on the board and thankful that he's able to join us today. So with that, by way of introduction, I hand it over to Jason Storah.
Thank you very much, Alice. So that was a very kind introduction. And I don't know whether I'm a reformed CRO or a recovering CRO, but one or the other. And Ian, I loved your phrase of you can ask a question, but generally the answer is no. I think I might be copying that in a few of the scenarios going forward. So look, thank you very much to PACICC and both Alistair and Ian for inviting me to be part of this today. You know, before I dive into this topic, I think I've got one question for you, which is, have you had enough of COVID-19 yet? Well, I know I have. And, you know, this pandemic has created unprecedented challenges and change. It's also brought about, you know, often ignored societal issues right to the forefront. But for me, it's given me time to reflect and refocus my priorities. And there's 4 lessons that I've taken away from COVID and the pandemic, which I believe absolutely apply to climate change. The first is that climate change is our new normal, and you can no longer, you know, pretend it doesn't exist, ignore it, and think that it's just going to go away on its own. The second is that, you know, the profound impact of COVID, I think, pales by comparison to the impact of climate change ahead of us. The third is that, as we saw through the pandemic, the most vulnerable are often the hardest hit. And then the fourth one is that, you know, it's been science and vaccinations that are getting us through COVID-19. And I think it's going to be science and innovation that's going to get us through climate change. So we couldn't escape the pandemic by pretending it doesn't exist. You know, I think we faced it for the most part head on, accepted its impact on our daily lives, adapted and worked together, again, for the most part, just to try and find solutions. So we're at a point now where today, over 80% of eligible Canadians are fully vaccinated. You know, we're seeing friends and family members, and hopefully the upcoming holiday season will look and feel more normal this year than it has, you know, last year. But we also know a few things are different, and you know, we all know now exactly, I think, how far 6 feet apart is. We probably all wash our hands a little bit more than we used to, and I think it's the norm that, you know, we see little kids now using hand sanitizers when they walk into or out of grocery stores. So this is our new normal. And many of the behaviours that we've learned during the pandemic are going to stay with us for a period of time. I think some of them are going to stay with us for the rest of our lives. Just as COVID-19 has become our new normal, so has climate change. There is no more denying it or ignoring it. and the impacts of climate change are very real and they're very much upon us. The increased frequency and severity of weather events are proof of that. You know, climate change models show it could be much deadlier in Canada than COVID-19 has been. So we need to step up our focus and our action now. When it comes to climate change, though, I'm not just worried about it because of my role at Aviva and Aviva as a business. You know, I'm worried about the fact that I have a 10-year-old son and I have no idea what sort of future he's going to face. And I'm worried that the solution is right in front of us right now. You know, the solution we all saw with COVID and the pandemic, the solution of science, just keeps getting ignored when it comes to climate change. And at some point, you know, my fear is that it becomes too late. This summer we watched as the entire town of Lytton, BC was lost to wildfires. And I don't know about you, but it feels to me that wildfires are getting more frequent and more severe. You know, the latest IPCC report tells us to expect more heat waves, more rainfall, and an increased risk of wildfires and flooding. So the science is quite clear. To get to net zero, the world needs to undergo unprecedented, transformative change on a scale similar to the first industrial revolution. It's got to happen at a much faster pace. Yet, the climate change analysis recently presented at COP26 warns that global temperatures are set to rise alarmingly by at least about 2.4 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial levels by the end of this century. Even in the best case scenario, even if every government fully implemented all of their emissions reduction targets at the moment, the Earth is still going to warm by at least 1.8 degrees. Unfortunately, Canada is among the countries that are furthest off track from delivering on our emissions reduction pledges, and we're just not doing enough. You know, climate is undoubtedly the most prevalent risk for insurers globally. And despite the pandemic still looming large, climate risk took the top spot in AXA's 2021 Global Future Risks Report, which was released a couple of months ago. And it surveyed over 23,000 risk experts and members of the public. So for the first time in the survey's history, also the World Economic Forum's 2020 Global Risks Report of top 5 risks were all environmental. They were extreme weather, climate action failure, natural disasters, biodiversity loss, and human-made environmental disasters. So the business case for transition towards net zero is pretty clear. It's going to help businesses avoid risks such as supply chain or market disruption, business delays, stranded assets, all sorts of future, health challenges as well. And it's essential that our industry leaders and the wider corporate sector and government recognize and seize on these opportunities. More and more companies are now talking and placing value on ESG, environmental, social, and governance factors. And that's something that Aviva has been focused on for the last 3 decades. A 2020 report from the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance found that at the start of 2020, global sustainable investment reached $35.3 trillion across the major markets. And that's a 15% increase just in the last 2 years alone. So while some companies, though, may have mature ESG strategies, I know that many still don't understand what ESG means for them. For Aviva, we undertook a materiality assessment, which included speaking to over 9,000 of our internal and external stakeholders globally to understand and prioritize on what are the most important issues for them, both now and in the future, across all of our operations, our investments, our products, and our stakeholders and areas of influence. This process identified and ranked 43 material issues across 11 categories, and the results informed the development of our own sustainability ambition, which focuses on 3 pillars: climate action, stronger communities, and running a sustainable business. So my recommendation for businesses who may be at a different part of the learning curve on ESG is to act. There's 3 things. You've got to actively consider and state your position on climate and sustainability. You need to set ambitious targets that you are open and transparent with, and you need to take real action on delivering on those commitments that you make. Not doing so could quickly become a reputational and strategic risk to all business models. I think customers and society are paying more attention and going to hold businesses even more accountable going forward. And they expect us to deliver and have made it clear that any greenwashing or blue washing just isn't going to be tolerated. I mean, I'd never even heard of greenwashing until not that long ago. So it's becoming part of everyday vocabulary and something that people are focusing on. Again, at Aviva, we believe we've got a responsibility to act for our people and our customers and shareholders, and to all of the communities in which we do business. So we're committed to delivering on our own net zero ambition by 2040. Again, going back to COVID-19, the profound impact of the pandemic just pales by comparison to the impact of climate change. And as I mentioned earlier, it's the most vulnerable that get hardest hit. We're already seeing the local impact here in Canada, as well as obviously globally. You know, around the world, climate crisis is driving massive displacement and limiting natural resources like drinking water. The UN Refugee Agency cites that extreme weather events like prolonged droughts, increased rainfall, rising sea levels, and increasing cyclones are forcing up to 20 million people a year to leave their homes. That's more than half the Canadian population every single year. Locally, you know, we know there's a need for a natural adaptation strategy, which is gaining more urgency. And there was a recent federal report which showed that Canada's most remote and rural communities are feeling the effects of climate change more than the larger cities. And what makes it worse is they don't have the same resources and funding or money to adapt and protect themselves and their homes. In June of this year, a coalition of insurers, including Aviva, municipalities, Indigenous organisations, environmental, non-governmental organisations, and research organisations, got together to form Climate Proof Canada. And this coalition is calling on the federal government to take action now to create a culture of preparedness and build a more disaster resilient country. Among the asks they had, there was a few that I just wanted to draw out. The first was that a national adaptation strategy with measurable targets and that leverages private sector capacity, working together between public and private sector. The second was there's a need to reduce the risk and impacts of flooding across the country, pretty topical at the moment if you're living in British Columbia. And then the third was that there was a need to ensure that sustainable finance initiatives leverage the private sector capacity to assess, disclose, and manage escalating physical risks. You know, as insurers, we have an active role to play in helping mitigate and adapt to climate change and bend the curve on the alarming trends that we now see. Every single day, we see firsthand the impact that climate change has on our customers' lives and how we can help our customers become more resilient. Recently, the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices found that Canada's infrastructure decisions aren't accounting for climate change. So these risks, this risk leaving Canadians extremely and increasingly vulnerable, both physically and financially in the future. The insurance industry also has a massive opportunity, though, to influence change. And with simple changes to our actions and how we do business, we can have a much bigger impact on building climate resiliency for all of our customers. So what have we done? Have we done this so far? Unfortunately, the answer is no. I'll just use a couple of examples. You know, following the 2016 wildfire in Fort McMurray, the insurance industry paid $3.6 billion in claims, including reinstalling vinyl siding on up to 2,500 homes that were destroyed or badly damaged by fire. For an additional 0.4%, so in this case, just $14 million, all of these homes could have been clad in fire-resistant cement board siding, which would likely have reduced the risk of subsequent fire damage by over 40%. Then more recently, following last year's hailstorm in Calgary that damaged more than 30,000 homes, for an additional 2.7%, which would have been just $35 million, every one of those homes could have been retrofitted with Class 4 hail impact resilient asphalt shingles, again reducing the risk of hail damage by up to 80% in this instance. These are both hugely missed opportunities and are not a record for us as an industry to be proud of. And then, as I mentioned a second ago, you know, just looking at the news about the floods in BC right now, I have no doubt that there will be recommendations and opportunities to build back better for all of those people affected out in BC. But the question is, will we do it? We can and we must do better for Canadians. Currently, Aviva, alongside a number of other insurers, is working with the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction on the world's first Build Back Better program for consumers. And this is going to see our industry lead by example and rebuild post-disaster with climate resilient materials. Aviva has been carbon neutral since 2006, And like I mentioned earlier, we're working towards our ambition to be net zero by 2040. Our climate commitment covers our entire value chain, from operations, underwriting, products, claims, and investments. And within operations, our goal is to get to net zero sooner, actually by 2030. All of our offices will use 100% renewable electricity by 2025. And then, we're moving all of our new company car leases to electric vehicles. A net zero insurance industry is a fundamental part of helping shift the economy towards protecting the planet. In terms of underwriting, as an insurer, we're using one of our biggest levers, our underwriting policies, to affect change. Beyond offering climate conscious products, by the end of this year, we're going to stop insuring companies that make more than 5% of their revenue from thermal coal or unconventional fossil fuels, unless they're committed to the Science-Based Target Initiative, and we've been able to engage with them about the plans and the actions that they're going to put in place. We're also working with several of our global competitors to develop an approach and a methodology to net zero underwriting. Aligning what we insure with net zero means that we can help foster the transition to a low carbon economy. Individually, all members have committed to transition our underwriting portfolios to net zero by the middle of the century. And as a next step, the Alliance is looking to grow its membership to include brokers and industry trade associations. With regards to products and services, on that front, since 2016, Aviva globally has had a 90% increase in green and socially inclusive insurance products. This includes overland water insurance coverage here in Canada and our Green Assure endorsement, which covers the cost of energy efficient and environmentally friendly products to replace damaged or destroyed property. We also recognise the important role that insurers should play in rewarding customers for environmentally responsible actions. With this in mind, we're offering green products, including electric vehicle insurance, home renewable energy equipment coverage, and products that support the shared economy. One of the toughest nuts to crack, though, in insurance, from a sustainability and a net zero perspective, is claims. And I'm sure that this group can appreciate just how we make our claims processes sustainable and closed loop as possible has a massive bearing on how far the insurance industry can go. We're working to reduce our environmental footprint of our claims handling through focusing on repair and restore. Wherever possible, we're diverting waste from landfills, either through recycling or repurposing all of the various materials that get discarded. And we're also baselining our claims supplier emissions and learning about their environmental management practices, like how they handle waste. We know that the net zero journey could be new to many vendors, so we're supporting them the best that we can, and we want to engage with them proactively. But at the same time, there's also a number who are ahead of us, so we'll look to learn from them. I hope that all insurers are going to join us in tackling the challenge of sustainable claims, but I know it's a complex challenge. And I also therefore know that we can't do this alone. But that's why we need the full weight of the industry behind this. In that way, we're going to serve customers with the best possible outcomes in a way that minimises the environmental impact. Last but not least would be investments. If any financial services company not looking at its own indirect emissions like investments is likely to be missing more than 90% of its carbon challenge. And we've set interim targets to reduce the carbon intensity of our policyholder assets at 25% by 2025 and then 60% by 2030. The easy thing to do, of course, would be to sell off all of our energy and utility stocks and bonds today, but we all know that doesn't do anything in the real world. So the harder, more useful thing to do is to be an active owner and be engaged and use our own muscle and leverage in the market to work with and push companies that we invest in to commit to developing and acting on their own ambitious climate plans. And we believe this is how we're going to drive real change. As the world's economy transitions to low carbon, the need to improve away from fossil fuel investments toward greener ones, like renewable energy projects, will become more and more urgent. And the risk of stranded assets is very real. As part of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero just recently, Aviva, alongside a number of other leading financial institutions that together are responsible for over $90 trillion in assets, is working to accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy. This alliance also allows for strategic coordination amongst financial institutions and gives a collective voice to push governments to change. and restructure the global financial system. Of course, with any coalition, words and promises are just the beginning. We need to collectively deliver results. And to that end, Aviva Canada is committed to investing $350 million in our green assets by 2023. And so far, we're tracking really well. We've exceeded our target of $100 million this year. The fourth and final learning from the pandemic that I mentioned earlier, and one that we're all benefiting from, is that it's science and vaccinations that are getting us through COVID-19. And it's science, innovation, and collaboration that are going to get us through climate change. At Aviva, many companies, collaboration is just so important, and you want it to be part of your DNA. So bringing others along on this journey, sharing our knowledge and expertise, and learning from others is so important. If we're going to really influence change, the full weight of the insurance industry and the wider financial sector has to come together and develop and build a collective knowledge and set of actions. Along with representatives from a broad number of leading Canadian companies and my counterparts from other insurance companies, I'm pleased to also be part of the federal government's Sustainable Finance Action Council. And this council was formed with two sort of aims in mind. First is to champion the implementation of sustainable finance best practices across Canada's financial sector and the economy at large. And then second is to grow the sustainable finance market in Canada to help accelerate the movement of private capital to support Canada's transition to net zero by 2050, and again help ensure that climate resiliency build-out. This council is making recommendations on the market infrastructure needed to attract and scale sustainable financing in Canada. And there's a few headlines that I think are topical at the moment. Some of those recommendations include enhanced assessment and disclosure of climate risks and opportunities, better access to climate data and analysis, and then common standards and definitions for sustainable and low carbon investment. The Council's first priority has been on enhancing climate-related financial disclosures in Canada's private and public sector, aligned with the TCFD recommendations. And this is another indication of the growing focus on TCFD reporting. This Council is going to work closely with Canada's independent net zero advisory body to ensure climate considerations are taken into financial decision making and vice versa. So breaking down silos and improving communications across sectors is going to be crucial to meeting Canada's climate commitments. At Aviva, we believe collaborations like these can help to raise the bar on everybody's efforts and deliver the trillions of dollars that are needed each year to achieve the Paris Agreement commitments. One of our most critical and one of the partnerships I'm most proud of at the moment at Aviva is what we've done with the World Wildlife Fund in Canada. So we're the lead supporter of the Canada and Natural Grant Programme, and we've committed over $1 million to support local groups and Indigenous organisations to restore degraded habitats and improve community resiliency across Canada. Partnerships like this help us look at the big picture. Fixing a home means nothing if we ignore the natural surroundings and the degraded lands and shorelines that those homes are built around. Protecting and enhancing the planet's precious biodiversity is an integral part of our sustainability work, and experts agree that the dual crises of climate change and biodiversity loss are inextricably linked, so they've got to be tackled together. Our biodiversity policy, published recently will help guide our climate work. We've also signed the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge that commits us to doing our part to reverse the nature loss by 2030. And specifically, at Aviva, we've identified 5 areas where we feel we can make a real contribution. We're going to engage with and support other communities we work with to address biodiversity impacts and associated risks. This goes back to my earlier mention of using our underwriting policies and investment muscle to influence positive change. Similarly, we'll use our position to eliminate deforestation. As a first step, we're carrying out a formal assessment of our portfolios for deforestation risk. We'll also work to influence government and policymakers to make the necessary systemic changes. Governments have to agree and commit clear and shared goals with targets and interim milestones to stem and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. Companies and financial institutions need to assess and report on both their impacts and dependencies on nature, so that they can help people understand the nature-related risks and opportunities in those businesses. And then finally, to limit harm, we're going to promote biodiversity through restoration with initiatives like the World Wildlife Fund grant program, which restores habitats through nature-based solutions. There are ample opportunities for our employees, our brokers, our partners, our suppliers, and even our customers to get involved in this kind of initiative. I referenced the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices earlier, and their report shows that within 30 years, climate change will likely increase annual coastal flood damages to homes and buildings from about $60 million now to as much as $300 million. By the end of the century, if sea levels continue to rise, those same damages could increase to approaching $1.2 billion per year. To properly assess the climate risk to our businesses, Aviva uses value at risk, which is designed to provide a forward-looking and return-based valuation assessment to measure climate-related risks and opportunities in our investment portfolio. This methodology provides a view on the future physical impacts of climate change and how these changes could affect people's insurance premiums. The analysis was unsurprising. Unless we actively mitigate climate risk in line with a 1.5 to 2 degree world, we should expect significant adverse financial impacts from climate change. Therefore, we must actively reduce the carbon emissions of our investment portfolio while also mitigating the impact of weather-related losses. With this compelling data in hand, we've embedded climate risk into how we do business. The net zero metrics and targets across our business that I discussed earlier are part of our business planning and decision making, and we share them quite openly. Climate-related risk and opportunities and management responsibilities are built into our board and risk management committees. Our boards have gone through extensive training on climate risk and responsibilities, and we developed a climate training plan for all of our people, and will build on their passion to help tackle the climate emergency. As leaders, I believe it's important for us to walk the talk and lead from the top. My executive team and I cascade these priorities across all areas of the business. They're reinforced by climate action plans across varying business units, monitored at an executive level, with a steering committee and individual clear accountabilities to help ensure that plans turn into tangible outcomes. With quarterly check-ins on progress, milestones, all the resource planning that you would expect, companies like ourselves should be doing. We have clear roles and responsibilities related to climate risk, including 3 lines of defence. Myself as the CEO, the Chief Risk Officer, and the audit team. And we've developed a TCFD dashboard. And in Canada, we're beginning formal public reporting from next year on what we're doing, because we believe that climate disclosure is critical and should be addressed and mandated for all financial institutions and beyond. It's been endorsed by the G7 and the G20 in the UK and New Zealand, that they've all introduced mandatory reporting and disclosure requirements that are very much aligned to the TCFD recommendations. In Canada, there have been consistent endorsement, again from the TCFD, including the Government of Canada. And in the 2021 federal budget, the government committed to require all Crown corporations to adopt TCFD requirements and standards as part of their corporate reporting by 2024. Crown corporations with assets of more than $1 billion need to start that in 2022. More importantly for everyone here is the growing support for mandatory climate reporting and disclosure from financial regulators. I'm sure most of you saw the news from October when the Canadian Securities administrators proposed requirements to standardize climate-related disclosure by companies aligned with the TCFD, and this is hugely encouraging. If I could quote Grant Vingo, the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of the Ontario Securities Commission, he said that this would set up the Canadian market for success, making us more competitive with European markets that are currently ahead of us in climate disclosure. And increasingly, investors are looking for clear and consistent information, as we know. However, mandating disclosure and reporting is only half the battle. An important next step is agreeing on standard taxonomy and disclosure to provide clearer guidelines and consistency for companies. It's increasingly important too for financial institutions to have their transition plans in place and again, clearly communicated. Disclosure, while important, just is not enough on its own. A credible transition plan should outline the clear steps that companies will take to address the risks and to capitalize on opportunities as the world transitions towards a low carbon economy. It should ensure a company's business model, growth strategy, and capital investments align with net zero and the 1.5 degree world. There's been a recent promising, amount of progress on this. At Finance Day at the COP26 a few weeks ago, the UK announced new requirements for financial institutions to publish net zero plans by 2050 transition plans. And this follows the earlier mentioned Glasgow Financial Alliance's call on G20 leaders to set policies that will accelerate the transformation of the financial system. So I would urge all Canadian decision makers to follow the UK's leadership and mandate climate disclosure and reporting and transition plans. Aviva is going to be releasing, as I said, our transition plan later this year, and we've signed up to the science-based targets to ensure that our business pathway aligns with the Paris Agreement. Along with embedding climate risk, we can't ignore the importance of integrating climate science and modelling into underwriting. Climate research continues to advance, and there are brilliant minds working on this here in Canada and around the world, including groups like the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices that I mentioned earlier. So let's leverage these advancements and incorporate climate modelling into our decision making. A clear, forward-looking perspective on climate is an important, sometimes overlooked aspect of managing and understanding risk trends. So it's science, it's innovation, and it's collaboration that's going to get us through climate change. During the pandemic, we trusted the science and we acted accordingly. And most importantly, we acted together. But the research has now been done. There's a lot more being done, but we have enough in front of us. We know the anticipated climate impacts to our business. We're already seeing them. So it's time to roll up our sleeves and do our part to adapt to the changing climate, restore biodiversity loss, and lower our emissions to avoid the worst kind of effects. The insurance industry, as you all know, is part of the wider financial community and has so much influence to move capital in the direction we want to go. But to make an impact, climate change has to be considered and embedded in every part of our business and our decision making. I know the power and influence of everybody here. So to all of the chief risk officers here, along with businesses and governments and people that do other roles, if you haven't already started, please start embedding climate risks backed by climate science into your business strategies and plans. Even if the methodologies aren't yet perfect and the path isn't perfectly laid out, we've got to start and we need to act. So, as I think I mentioned earlier, and just to wrap up, good intentions and promises have to translate into actions and results. Only then will we, together, transform the Canadian economy into the low carbon one that we know we need and that we know can create a better tomorrow for all Canadians. So let's get on it. Let's get to work. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me today.
That's great, Jason. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask the audience out there, do you have questions or comments on Jason's talk this afternoon? Just use the taskbar to identify. There's Alistair has a question, so to put your hand up and we'll get to them in order. So let's go to Alistair.
Thank you, Jason. Quite inspiring, honestly. I think you did a fantastic job of articulating kind of the magnitude of the challenge ahead and the urgency that we have to have uppermost in our minds about starting yesterday. Just the practical question, Canada is a resource extraction nation. And a substantial portion of our economy is attached to extraction of what might be higher carbon emitting materials, oil and gas, notably oil more than gas. And even there is some nuance. What struck me, and maybe that's the right word for it, is that worldwide, as you know, there are some insurers that are across the board withdrawing insurance capacity and investing capital from Canadian oil sands. It struck me that I heard a more nuanced position from Aviva because a portion of that extraction community is now committed to net zero 2050, committed to proper TFCD disclosure, and are ready to demonstrate that they have a science-based plan to get there. The practical question is a lot of investment is going to be required, which needs capital. And a lot of innovation is going to be required, which has risk. And it's still a transition. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about how Aviva is approaching this kind of delicate nuance of continuing to support organizations that are currently extracting, because you're committed to helping support them and Canada and the world transition to a lower carbon economy.
Yeah, no, great question, Alistair. I mean, I don't think entering into this with a mindset that's exclusionary works. I think you've got to enter into it with a mindset of engagement. So that's why we've said we want to work with all of our suppliers and firms that we invest in and all of our partners to engage and understand what are the plans that people have in place. It would be really hypocritical if Aviva turned around and started dropping organizations and things left, right, and center when we know there's a transition that needs to get us from where we are today to where we need to be, which is why we've said we will work with companies that are very open and transparent about what they're doing. It doesn't mean that everybody needs all the answers today, but it means that they need to be dedicated to the, putting the time and the attention and capital into what does the future look like for them, and committed to science-based targets. Right, I think this debate, and look, we've seen it in other areas. We saw it in the pandemic. The difference between the scientific view of what can be done and the non-scientific view of what can be done. I can tell you, certainly my colleagues in Aviva don't subscribe to non-scientific based decision making. We use data and we follow what the data says, and we follow the trends and the analysis and the science. So we want to work with any organisations that are committed to the same kind of path and future that we are on those plans. I think there's instances where we can help inform. And, I would say that in the UK, Aviva is a much bigger organisation, relatively speaking, in the UK than Canada in terms of market share, market size. And we've seen a number of examples over the last year or so of government, local government, national government, and other organisations working with us and engaging in a very open way, so that we learn together and we collectively build those plans. And one of the areas you referenced, oil and gas industry and the extraction industries in Canada. I mean, I'm really interested in it. I would like to believe that carbon capture is a technology that Canada should be leading the forefront on. I will be honest, I don't know if that's the case today. I don't know. I suspect that most people in this event don't know where carbon capture in Canada sits in terms of the scientific advances and how effective it is compared to other countries around the world. But we need to pick those sorts of things and focus on them, and focus on the companies and governments that are committed to them. But the overarching message from me and from Aviva is the best way to approach this is through collaboration, and you do that through engaging with people, not excluding them.
Okay, are there others? Thank you for that. Are there other people with questions out there? I see, Alistair, your hand's coming back up.
I've got another different one.
Okay,
if there's not a lineup.
Please do, thank you.
So, Jason, no matter what we do between now and 2050, we're going to see global temperatures climb, and our climate is going to throw at us the consequences of that. So in terms of adaptation to climate change, which I think is kind of a central theme of the work that Don Forgeron and the IBC are engaged in, this is a lot of dialogue between our industry and the federal and provincial governments and municipal governments about what can be done to mitigate more effectively the consequences of climate change. If there were kind of a couple of things on your CEO wish list for promoting and accelerating that adaptation in Canada, what would they be?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, let's use BC right now as an example. Early stats, I don't know if this is what when all is said and done and we've identified all of the claims and all of the people affected, but the early stats in BC seem to suggest that less than 25% of people insured have overland water flood coverage. That's a problem. So what is it that meant that most people, the vast majority of people in BC, didn't think that flood coverage was a problem for them? Now, I don't know if 25% will be the final number. It's really early days. It might be 50%, it might be 75%, but it's not 100%. So, I'm using that as an example because I think collective education is really, really important. And that education has to be simple. We all know insurance is far too complex. Right, we all make it more complicated than it needs to be. But I think working with government on educating people is task number one. Working with government on prioritising what are the areas that are most at risk, what are the changes that can be made. I quoted Fort McMurray and Calgary Hail, some of the actions that the industry could have taken. And look, if I was in government, I'll say this, perhaps I might regret it, but if I was in the Canadian government, when you see those natural catastrophes, I'd be reaching out to the industry saying, so where can you pay a little bit more for an incrementally or exponentially better outcome in terms of future resiliency? And the ICLR are doing a brilliant job around Build Back Better. And I know that this is something that IBC is focused on as well. So I think, again, engaging with government, helping to educate consumers. I think the reality is increasingly, the thing that worries me is that more and more people are living in potentially uninsurable zones and areas that might not be uninsurable today, but will become uninsurable in the not too distant future. So, we've got to get this message out there, and governments are going to have to help, potentially people rebuild in different areas. And look, we saw that, the Slave Lake, not that long ago. I forget, was that 2013? Slave Lake, I can't remember, but the government and the building and the planning components of people being able to rebuild didn't do anybody any favors. And as I said, I'm being quite open about what the insurance industry could have done in terms of paying claims and helping people get better siding or better roofs. The government's got to own that as well. And I think that's only going to happen if the industry and government work together without pointing fingers at each other, but just saying, actually, what's our mutual responsibility here? And particularly as we start to see more and more people who become uninsurable, there is a very likelihood, and I know that, Alistair, this is one of your favourite topics, is government stepping in, backstopping, taking a role or a responsibility where it just isn't economically viable for the private sector alone to solve all of the problem for everybody.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions or comments from the audience out there?
I'm used to Alistair peppering me with questions. He's great at that.
All good.
A quiet group, otherwise.
So you're mentioning, Jason, it's obviously it's an issue with big companies in the industry. It's an issue right across the industry. But what advice would you have if you're a smaller company out there and they're sitting and saying this really is a kind of a big company issue to take a leadership role? What advice or what things can you say to people out there? Because we have quite a spectrum of reps joining us online today, large and small. What would be your advice, actions they can take, smaller companies, to kind of join the fight?
Well, Canada's economy is built on small businesses, right? It's built on smaller companies. And yes, we always think about the large companies and the dominant impact and number of employees that they have. But, I would say there's enough material out there. There's enough experts. It's evolving rapidly that if you are serious about this, there is enough expertise that you can tap into. So it's not something that you need to just do off the side of your desk, nor should it be something that you do off the side of your desk. I think there's enough published material and there's enough experts out there, whether that's in government or in the private sector, that you can engage with to start building out the actions and the plans that are relevant for your business.
Very helpful. Other questions, comments from the field? Give everyone 1 minute here to summon the courage, and otherwise.
No problem. Well, thank you for having me, Ian.
Yes, Jason, thank you
Nice.
sincerely. It's a great speech and very, very valuable information for the industry. And we use this, our forum meetings, to connect CEOs in the industry, leading firms, to talk about issues of the day. And it's very timely with the world leaders gathering to talk about climate change on the same month that we do this at the industry level. And you've given some very thoughtful advice for people out there. And a copy of this will be, of course, placed on our website, so people will see this in future as well. And if there are no other questions or comments, thank you, Jason. And we're going to take a few minutes, take a bio break before we call up our next speaker, and a chance to grab messages, whatever. It's a 3-hour meeting, so we want to kind of pace ourselves here, but we'll be back in a minute. And again, thank you, Jason, and everybody out there. We'll be back in a minute, and we'll carry on with the second hour of discussion. Thank you. Okay, everybody, we are back. We are heading into our second hour of discussion 5 minutes early, but I think there is lots of food for thought in this second presentation. And it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Sandra Chapman is primarily, but not exclusively, a plasma physicist working on nonlinear and complex systems in astrophysics and in the laboratory. She is professor of physics and director of the Center for Fusion, Space and Astrophysics at the University of Warwick in the UK. And she's also the adjunct professor of mathematics and statistics at the University of Tromsø. She's an expert on space weather phenomena and has published more than 190 papers in the refereed literature and a textbook on electrodynamics. She is the recipient of numerous awards in the industry, including a Lloyd's of London Science of Risk Prize earlier this year. And she's also an artist, so she has extra time. She will talk, no doubt, about bridging the divide between arts and science. So a pleasure, Sandra, having you on the line here today. And this builds on the discussion in earlier discussion Sandra and I had about space weather. We had our webinar on October 20th and looked at solar storms. So if you watched that webinar, hopefully you had a chance to look at that online or participate on October 20th. But Sandra's going to pick up the torch from that point and carry on and talk about space weather phenomena today. So I think we're throwing control over to you, Sandra, to lead with the slides.
So if I just share my screen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let me see.
Just make sure that technology is on our side today.
Hopefully you can see my screen.
Not yet.
How about now?
Yes, perfect.
Lovely. Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Right. Now, I'm not sure that I can see the comments as I speak. So if somebody makes a comment, please can I ask you to tell me?
Oh, absolutely. I'll find a time, Sandra, that we can just kind of interrupt and say that we have somebody that's put their hand up.
Absolutely. I'm happy to be interrupted. Okay.
Wonderful.
So,
we want to make this conversational and interactive. So please, people, as Sandra goes through her presentation, just feel free to put your hand up. Thank you.
Okay. So what I wanted to do is pick up, as you say, pick up from the previous talks. I had to look at the slides, and they were really nice introduction to the various aspects of space weather and you know, and the possible consequences. So I'm not going to do that work again. Instead, I'm going to kind of build on this, and what I want to do is, you know, I'm understanding this is a reasonably technical audience, right? So I can show numbers and graphs and things. I want to kind of really give you a flavour for what's doable about space weather. In other words, you know, what do we know well? You know, what's kind of well known, and what is challenging about it? What's difficult to kind of get results on, and why? Okay, and of course, what you want to know, I assume, I mean, I'm an academic, right? Is you want to know how likely a space weather event of a certain impact is. Okay, and the other thing you're going to want to know, if you don't know about the solar cycle, you will by the end of this talk, that there is a solar cycle of activity. And so we want to know how this might be varying in time. Okay, so that's basically what I'm going to do, talk about this. But the question is, well, how good is the data? I want to give a flavour for that. What's well established and what's kind of topical, what we're arguing about in the field, you know, to give a flavour of that, you know, so what are we certain about and what we're not so certain about. And it's kind of interesting and tricky, and there's some history in it and everything. Okay, so that's kind of where I'm going with this talk. As I say, do interrupt, because of course I'm trying to talk from one field to another if there's something you don't quite understand what I'm trying to say. Okay, so here is a newspaper's description of space weather. I thought I'll just do a very quick intro for those who might have missed the previous talk. And the idea is that you have a solar flare, and I'll show you more details of this in a minute. Okay, and you know, so these are triggered on the sun's surface, and then they move towards the Earth. Okay, they reach the Earth, and they cause a disturbance by interacting with the Earth's geomagnetic environment. So this is the plasma and the magnetic field of the Earth. Okay, and so the thing that's famous, of course, you see the northern lights, the aurora, but there's a lot of other effects as well. And so that's basically the main idea. Okay, and there are a lot of impacts. Just to talk you through what happens. Some of them are very fast and some take a little bit longer. So the prompt things are, when you get this eruption from the surface of the sun, it forms a shock. It's traveling through a medium. It's not a vacuum out there. There is some, you know, plasma, very, you know, almost vacuum, but not quite. So you get a shock. So this heats particles. And so the heated particles radiate, and they produce a radio burst. So if you happen to be on the Earth and your radar, which you might be using, you know, to help aircraft navigate, or you might be using, you know, as part of your defense against nuclear war, if that happens to be looking along the horizon when this radio burst happens, you think somebody's trying to jam your radar. Okay, and this has been a kind of interesting historical thing that's, you know, in the Cold War, there were some instances of things on the Dew line causing problems with this. Okay, so there's this instantaneous stuff that can affect sort of, you know, radar, so the instantaneous radio burst. Then what happens is that you get energetic particles coming to the Earth. So this is radiation. So if you're out in space, if you're an astronaut outside of the Earth's protective magnetic field and so forth, you're in trouble. So when people are talking about going to Mars, this is something they're going to have to deal with. They're going to have a kind of hot room where they can go and hide from solar flares, because otherwise it'll kill you. Okay, so if you're now a satellite, you know, orbiting the Earth, you're mostly inside the protective layer. Okay, but there's still plasma there, and it can be heated and modified by the event, and so you can get failures in satellites. Okay, you can get problems where if you're trying to send things through the ionosphere, so now we're talking about GNS, you know, GPS, all this kind of thing, you know, navigation, because you change the ionosphere, the upper atmosphere, where you're trying to send your messages through, and so GPS timings can be effective. Navigation between aircraft could be affected. And as we come further down, the final thing, and the thing I'll talk most about, is what happens on the ground, because basically we're producing a big electrical current in space, and so you perturb anything that's a conductor on the ground. Okay, so obviously power grids. Okay, I'll talk a bit about that. But other things like drilling for oil, they use the Earth's magnetic field direction. And so, you know, if that kind of wobbles, that can be very expensive. So lots of things like this. So that's just a quick overview of the kind of space weather impacts. So as I say, the prompt effects are almost immediate, because they're light traveling at the speed of light. But the solar flare then comes, you know, the coronal mass ejection associated with it then propagates to the Earth. And this can take from a day to a few days. So in principle, you get a bit of warning. But that's the question, how useful is that? Okay, so now we've got lots of data now. So you might think, well, what's the problem? You know, and here are some examples of data. This is real data, everything's speeded up in time. What you're looking at here is, because the plasma, it's like a strip light, okay? It's like a fluorescent light, that it glows. So this is glowing like a fluorescent light, and it's trapped along magnetic field lines. So you can see what the magnetic field looks like on the sun, and that's where you see these lovely loops. Okay, they're being lit up by the plasma, and you can see this thing doing a little explosion. Okay, so you produce these flares, and here's one popping off the sun. These shots of the sun, again, this is data speeded up. Okay, they're done separated in time, and you'll notice sometimes the sun is quiet, i.e. it looks quite ordered. Sometimes it looks extremely disordered, like this chap here. Okay, so the magnetic field is very disordered. What you see on the sun is going to propagate out to us. So there are these different states of the sun. So this is the solar cycle. So roughly every 11 years, the sun goes quiet, active, okay, roughly, but not exactly. So this is going to affect the kind of likelihood of the storms happening, what kind, you know, how intense they are. there's a solar cycle dependence we have to figure out. Okay. But the other thing is you can see these things coming. And what I wanted to show you here, this is recent data. So this data is just coming from, you know, the 27th, the 10th to, you know, a few 8 days on. Okay. This is a white light image that we put a little disc in front of the sun. Okay. So it would not be too bright. So you can see what's happening around the sun. So this is what happens when one of these kind of structures, one of these flares happens. It produces a coronal mass ejection. So if I just run it, okay, and you see these lovely structures, these are the things that are coming at us. So mostly they go somewhere else. Okay, but here's one. You see, it was like a halo. So it's called a halo coronal mass ejection. It was coming right at us. Okay, and that's the one that caused the lovely aurora we had recently. I don't know if you're aware, you probably are, that there's been some really nice auroral displays. And this is why. Okay, these events reached, or at least a couple of these big halos reached the Earth and caused a disturbance. Okay, just because you have a nice aurora, though, doesn't mean that the power grid collapses every time. And this is a thing we have to think about. Okay, so we have all this kind of data, lots of different data recently. The little sparkling things, by the way, is the radiation that I was talking about, the solar protons, you know, that disturb the instrument that you're using to measure the white light. Okay, so we have this nice data with really good images of the sun now and really good images of stuff coming at us, you know, when a coronal mass ejection is emitted. Okay, and we've got lots of satellites sitting out there. And here's a kind of summary slide of all the satellites we've had, you know, within the last few years. And so these things fly around the system, sampling the plasma in situ. And so you take all this data and you feed it through, you know, the brains of a large number of space plasma physicists over the years, and out comes a really complicated picture, which I'm not going to trouble you with all the details of this. The point about it is there's lots of detail. So there's lots of currents, you know, that are going to impact on Earth. And so this is just a static picture. This is just kind of on average what the thing does. Okay. But actually, of course, it's highly dynamic. So this is all the stuff that's going to cause the ground disturbances. So this is very kind of complicated. But on an event-by-event basis, we can model it, and there are models. In the same way that you have models for, you know, weather on the Earth, you know, I want to know if it's going to rain tomorrow, you can get a pretty decent feel for that. We can do that for space weather as well. Once you know what's coming, you know, in the solar wind, and you can map it into the model, and you, on an event-by-event basis, you can try and say, well, what's going to happen? And what's going to happen on the ground and where I am locally. Okay, so that can be done. But there are some issues as to getting it right, okay? But just to get, so before I get into those, I just wanted to show an example of the detail which we could do this stuff. So this is just a little bit of work I've been doing recently with the British Geological Survey. So their job is to keep the ground conductivity map of the UK. Okay, this is one of their jobs, British Geological Survey, is to know the ground conductivity, because obviously, if you want to know what happens if you have a rate of change of magnetic field, you wave a large piece of wire overhead, it causes, you know, a current to be induced in the ground. You want to know the ground conductivity, and that's what they do. And of course, they talk to the national grid, the UK national grid, and what you're looking at here is a schematic of a model of the UK's grid. Okay, it's detailed model, more detailed than the schematic here. Point is, we can play with this model. So what we can do, we can say, okay, we can measure one of these big events, and this picture here are where we have magnetometers on the ground. So we've got these magnetometers taking data all the time, and you'll see, actually, this looks great because it's like Europe, but the bit we're interested in, the UK, you'll see there's 1, 2, 3, 3 stations, maybe 4 if you count the one in Ireland as well. Okay, so we've got a few points where we measure the magnetic field. So what we could do, we could say, we'll take a big event that we saw, we'll take these few measurements, we'll feed it into a model for what we think the current system is doing in the sky, okay, the disturbance, and then we'll map that into, you know, the model of the national grid and see what happens. And so we can do this in quite a detailed way. I want you to notice on here the different colours are the different parts of the network. So the long lines, the black guys are the 400 kV lines, and you can see they go, you know, long distances. So they run across the country and they run up and down. Okay, so I just want you to see that they go across and they run up and down. I'll show you why. So what we're doing here, there's detail, but the basic idea is the following. We sort of said, well, what we want to know, this isn't just the induced current. It's if we had one part of the grid, would it know what was going on in another part? So we're looking at correlation, actually. It's a network built on correlation. And these are two different snapshots at different times. It varies like crazy when you go through the storm. So we're modeling the details of the storm. And you can see it picks out it does different things at different times. But you can see it picks out these horizontal lines. So these are the 400 kV lines. So what this is telling you, because of where the currents are always, aligned horizontally with the UK, that one part of this 400 kV line, yes, yes, you should. So somebody's just asked about, should you be worried about the ground conductivity thing? And the answer is yes, because different countries are regionally, they will have different responses to the same event. So one place might do just fine and another place might not, because of the ground conductivity. Also, is it close to the ocean? Things like this. So yes, in principle. So what I'm trying to get over here is it's possible to model these things if you want to know local information. There are these really good models of systems like power grids. So it is possible to go and model, say I've got a general risk of something. What does that mean in detail? So that's my answer to that question. Okay. So that's, I mean, not wanting to go into too much detail, just to give you a flavour of what we can do, okay, quite reliably, and what with the data that we have. Okay. So since we've got all this information, well, why can't we just predict everything? What's the problem? Why is there uncertainty? Well, the problems, just to kind of really cut to the chase, to summarize it, are basically this, that, the coronal mass ejection is big, but the Earth is small. In other words, it's hard to tell if it's going to hit or miss. So like those, I showed you that nice picture of a halo CME. Well, you can see the thing coming at us, but that doesn't mean it's going to hit the Earth. It's quite difficult to tell. So even though you see it coming a day or two away, you don't know a day or two away whether it's going to actually hit the Earth. Okay. The other problem is you cannot see here from the image which way the magnetic field's pointed. This matters. Without going into lots of physics, if the Earth's field is pointing one way, if the field in the coronal mass ejection is pointing the other way, if they're opposite directions, they can kind of locally cancel out, and so plasma can get in, so that it can access our protected magnetic shell much more easily for one direction of field line compared to the other. And we don't know what the magnetic field's doing until it actually flies over a satellite. And we usually have a satellite parked just upstream of the Earth. Okay, there's a point just upstream of the Earth where the gravity of the Earth is matched by the gravity of the sun. And so you can kind of park a satellite there, okay? And we usually have one of these. And so once it reaches this point, you can say, oh, well, this is the way the magnetic field's going. Now we have an idea of how, bad this might be. So that's the second problem. So you don't get as much notice as you think. The third one, of course, is we never know when these solar flares are going to pop up in the first place. And that's just an open problem. That they sit there, the structure sits there and it sits there and it sits there in the sun, suddenly it goes unstable and we don't know why. So although we know a hell of a lot of detail about, well, what could happen once this and this, just predicting it when, how likely it is at all is open. Okay. So okay, to say something about that, then we'll count events. We'll say, okay, we want to kind of say, well, let's look at the frequency of occurrence of these things. So we're going to look across time now. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. And so that's kind of most of the rest of what I'm going to talk about. Okay, and I'm going to focus on one particular impact, which is the magnetic field disturbances on the ground. Okay, so the thing that affects power grids, any long piece of wire on the ground, basically, as well as things like the drilling for oil and all this kind of stuff. So I'm going to focus on this particular aspect of it. But of course, there are all the other things as well that I can ask questions on if people want to know. And the thing you may have heard of, certainly as soon as anybody starts asking about space weather or whatever, is this Carrington event. Okay, so just to say, we're going to talk a bit about this Carrington event because this started the whole business of space weather. It's this observation. Okay, so Carrington, he was basically he was a gentleman scientist. Okay, and he had his observatory and he was making his typical observations of the sun sort of lunchtime. And somebody's asking me, do I know about the ground conductivity of our country? I would have thought you've got a geological survey who does this job. I'd be amazed if you don't. And I would have thought that the power industry know about it. So, you know, yes, I don't know it personally, but I'm sure it's known. I'm sure it's mapped. Okay. It was certainly where people live and where there are power cables, to answer that question. So how granular? Yeah, okay, that's a really interesting question. So if you think back to what I showed, I can just flip back actually. I'll just flip back to this guy. So this is showing a map over Europe of where the magnetometers are now. Okay, in the past there were less magnetometers, and you can see how, you know, okay, that you can't have them on the ocean, obviously, so they're not spread uniformly. And you can see that there's only a few in the UK. Look, there's a couple few over France, Europe, you know, tens. So that's not very well resolved. So what we do is you can take that as an input to a model, you know, a model for the current system. So to use it to constrain a model, but that is the actual measured granularity, if you like, of the magnetic field impact. That's where the magnetometers are. Okay, so you know, BGS, you know, if you've got a power grid, there's a kind of case to be made to maybe, you know, put more magnetometers in important places where the power grid is. So if you know there's a critical infrastructure, you might want to put a magnetometer there, just to get an idea of what the kind of typical ground impact's going to be, the current that's induced. Okay, so let me go back. Where were we? Yes. So this chap, the Carrington event. So this drawing, this is the publication where Carrington published it, and you can maybe just see it's a drawing of a sunspot, okay, and you can maybe see there's a little white thing. So he saw a solar flare go off, and a few days later there were auroral displays at very low latitudes, lovely massive aurorae, and at the time it was telegraph. The long wires were telegraph wires. So telegraph system was disrupted. The current system was so powerful they could run the telegraph system without power. So they were using the power of the aurora to run the telegraph system. That's how active it was. So it was extremely active. And this was the first time anybody made a connection between magnetic disturbances on the Earth and things going on the sun. And it was quite controversial at the time. That, you know, there was a big kind of, you know, argument about it, and the Astronomer Royal didn't agree with it for sort of decades and so forth. So, you know, it was quite controversial. And it was after this that people started putting magnetometers, the magnetometers that I was showing you, that we needed to know what the magnetic field was doing on the surface of the Earth because it could be modified. So for this reason, we don't have much data for the Carrington event, but it was huge. And of course, the question is always asked. Yeah, I think there's more, you know. If you want to know about the magnetometers, ask me afterwards and I'll direct you to a website where the data is and you can get maps of where they are. There'll be more than 13, honestly. So I ask me at the end, or at the end I'll put it in the chat where you can find about the magnetometers. I'm sure you're doing a lot better than that. Okay, I assure you it's not so bad. Nevertheless, I understand Canada is a very large area, so they're not going to be that densely placed. They tend to put them into kind of chains and things. So I think you've got more than 13. Okay. So enough to drive a model. You'll have enough to drive a model. Okay. Right. So yeah. So we want to say something about this Carrington event, where we don't really have data, and I'm going to come to that. Okay. What, of course, people always ask is the following question. You know, is it just going to be really expensive because I have to make my systems more resilient? I have to spend money, and this is what was done with Quebec after the power outage. They made the system more resilient. They spent money. So is it just expensive and inconvenient, or is it just such a catastrophe I can't build in resilience to it? You know, it's just off the scale. And you get these kind of, you know, pronouncements that, you know, a Carrington event will decimate Earth. Okay, so this is the question: is it going to be decimating the Earth, or is it just going to be a bit expensive? And money will have to be spent on resilience, and you'd have to figure out how much money to be spent, whether you want to spend that money, you know, or what have you. Okay, so this is what this is the open question. Of course, it comes to the sort of risk of large events, which is what I'm going to talk about. Okay, and then there is this issue of the solar cycle. So, and I'll talk about this as well. So, and this is just another kind of drawing of what I was showing before, that, you know, the sun can be very quiet, and here you can see it's quiet. There's a lot of little things going on, but no big flares really, quite an ordered flow. So you won't get many of these big CME events, but then it will become very disordered, and it does this on a roughly 11-year cycle. And we've got sunspot data going back a long time. So literally counting sunspots, you know, this lovely stuff that I'm showing you in green is in the extreme ultraviolet. Okay, so remember the plasma glows. It's a bit like a strip light. Okay, so the plasma glows and you see what the sun's doing. So the thing that goes back a long time, you know, 100 years, 200 years, is not that. It's what you see on the sun in white light. You could literally see it with a telescope. If you put a telescope to the sun, project it on a piece of paper, don't look at it obviously, you will see sunspots. And people have counted these sunspots, and they've counted them for a long time. So we have that record. And that's why we know that there is this roughly 11-year cycle. Okay. So, of course, we know the space weather is going to go up and down with the cycle. So we want to know how much it's going to go up and down in terms of the likelihood. And, you know, is the cycle starting, ending, this kind of thing. Okay. So we want to compare events, you know, sizes of events. And I told you, there's a lot of detail. But we just have to pick a number that everybody kind of agrees on that is a good way to say how big an event is. And this is called the DST, the Storm Index, okay? And I'll explain what it is. And we have this in the space age, and this, you can see why, okay? This is a picture of Explorer 1, so this is right after Sputnik. And you can see, you know, Van Allen is there, Von Braun is there, okay? This is NASA JPL. This is Explorer 1. And they put a detector on board. Okay, they actually put a detector on board that could measure radiation. And they found that there was a region outside the Earth, the Van Allen belts, or the radiation belts, where there's a lot of radiation. In other words, there's a lot of plasma there, a lot of particles there. So this thing carries quite a large current. Oh, you don't notice because it's a long way away, okay? So this current, okay, is there all the time. But if you imagine, you know, you hit the Earth with one of these CMEs, and particularly if the plasma can get in, it pumps up these radiation belts. They really fill up in a dynamic kind of a way. And so the current changes, and you can measure it on the Earth's surface, and that's what DST measures. The other thing to be aware of is if you think of geostationary satellites that sit in the same spot over the surface of the Earth, which are quite useful for communications and so forth, tend to go through these regions. So they kind of care about the state of the radiation belt. So we care about them. Okay, so we're interested in the magnetic field on the surface of the Earth at the equator that is perturbed when these things are pumped up by a storm. Okay, and so ever since Explorer 1, it's been, okay, we want to know about this. So that tells you how long the data record's going to be. Okay, so this thing called DST, what it is then is you say, okay, I would like to measure the impact on the Earth's surface from changing these radiation belts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 4 magnetometers that happen to be near the equator, and I'm going to kind of map them down so that they look like they're on the equator, and I'm going to take an average, okay? And, you know, it's quite low time resolution. There is a higher time resolution version available now, minute resolution. But this thing is just hour resolution or whatever, okay? This matters, okay, as we will see what the resolution of this thing is, okay? So if I plot the data, all the data we have for DST, which I'm plotting here, you can see this is the number of sunspots. So this is this solar cycle thing going up and down, roughly 11 years. And I've coloured in the most active times, different colours. And this is what DST does. So you can see it's very spiky because this is all the storms. Okay, and so you can see, okay, there's more storms, that's maximum, but actually there's storms other times as well. It's quite messy, okay. The other thing to know, of course, is we had to subtract off. These things are a few hundred nanotesla. It doesn't matter what, I mean, it's a measurement of magnetic field. But the thing you're subtracting off, the boring thing that's there all the time, is way larger. It turns out these numbers are pretty much the same as for climate change, that you're looking for like a 1 degree change, you know, on sort of 300 or whatever Kelvin. It's a similar kind of that you're trying to subtract off when you're looking at the change. Okay, interestingly. So a lot of work has gone on to sort this out. So the upshot of this is because we need to know what the background's doing, we need more than one station, because you can use all the stations to kind of subtract off the background, because it depends on, you know, the Earth is rotating, it depends on the season, all kinds of things, this background. So as long as you've got more than one station, maybe you can deal with it. This is quite an important point. Okay, so we're going to look at this thing, and people use this as a kind of benchmark. That when they talk about storms, if you look in the literature for risk, storm risk, papers on storm risks, people giving numbers, they will always talk about DST. A storm of whatever DST will occur, whatever. They will always talk about this in literature. Okay, and this is what it is. Okay, and here is just one example. So I thought, because if anybody wants to do anything with this, they're immediately going to go and look at the literature and say, okay, some guys have calculated the risk of storms of certain sizes. Well, what's the risk, and here is quite a good example. Okay, so this is taking data. So remember, it's only over like 4 or 5 solar cycles, because that's all you've got. Okay, and this is a plot. This is the complementary CDF, okay, of DST, selecting out events and all that. Okay, and so we get something like this. And what they've done is fit it. They've tried 2 distributions. You can see it is kind of power law, and then it goes off. Okay, so they fitted 2 distributions. One, the red guy is a power law. Okay, power law tail, and the blue guy is a log normal, so it kind of rolls off more. And the spread, all these are all bootstrap estimates, so you can see there's a kind of spread. And just using these different distributions, you get very different answers. Okay, so the big scary numbers, and I think in the last talk they mentioned these big scary numbers, is that a Carrington event, will occur in the next 10 years with a 10% chance. Okay, but if you use the log normal one, that goes down to 3%. Okay, and of course, so there's quite a lot of uncertainty at the bottom end here. Is the point, and it really matters how you constructed this thing, because you had to get the events out of the time series, and there's different ways of doing that. Peak over threshold kinds of things. All declustering. People do different things in different ways. Okay, depends what and how big you think the Carrington event actually was, because we didn't have DST then. There wasn't any DST. So how do we know how big it was? Okay, we'll come to that, right? So this is just to give you a feel of how certain, the statistics could be based on these last 4 or 5 cycles, where you've got quality data, but of course only a few cycles, and that's the problem. Okay, so this is, as I say, this is a nice example. There are many other nice examples out there where people have tried to look at this problem, and they usually look at DST. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to kind of get a handle on the solar cycle variation of DST. That last plot didn't do that. Okay, so here's my sunspot cycle again. You can see the DST going up and down. And what I've plotted here, it's a rank order plot. So for those who don't know, I'm assuming most of you kind of are familiar with these things, but just in case, if I take celebrities and line them up from small to big, okay, this is the rank order plot, celebrity heights, okay. And I'm doing the same sort of thing here with DST, just the values from the time series. I'm not trying to get bursts or events out even. I'm just take the data, and you can immediately see, well, look, this purple guy is taken from the last maximum, which was quite pathetic. The last cycle was quite pathetic, so it's quite small, and here are some bigger ones. Okay, so clearly there's a solar cycle variation in this guy. It's going to make a lot of difference in what the biggest events look like, so we need to kind of say something about this. Okay. And just to give you a feeling, though, just another feel for what this does, this is a better version of DST. This is a minute resolution one. And what we've done is we've just taken years and got quantiles. Now, I know this is dreadful, because, of course, the thing's not stationary, but, of course, we're interested in how it's changing. So, it's just to kind of give a feel for, how big it is. And so you can see that if you do that, if you take a year and ask for the quantiles, they kind of float up and down with the solar cycle. So the whole distribution is floating up and down with the cycle of activity. And that sounds fine until you realize that the solar cycles never repeat. Okay, so what I'm showing here, this is years. So this is now, this is the last cycle, 2000, 1950, 1900, 1880, 1860, so forth. We've got quite a lot. This is the sunspot number, and you can see basically they go up and down, and they're different. Like this one is like twice the size of this guy. Okay, and the durations change as well. So the problem is we never know what's coming. I mean, we're actually here. The next cycle is just getting going. As I say, we had this lovely auroral display. It's just getting going. We don't know how big it's going to be. I mean, obviously, people try and predict it. There's a lot of work on that. Okay, so we know that the level of activity, the storms, goes up and down with this guy. And so, we'd like to know what the next cycle was going to do, how what the sunspot count would be like, because that would tell us roughly how active it's going to be, how what the likelihood of a storm is going to do. So this is a kind of a problem. So I'm going to take care of the cycle variation. I'm going to look at that, but this kind of raising up and down of the strength of the cycle is another problem as well. So this is an open problem. Okay, so to try and address that, because DST only goes back like 4 or 5 cycles, and if you're looking at lots and lots of cycles, you'd like as many as possible. Okay, you'd like more than 4 or 5. We're going to try and go back further, and that means going back almost to the Carrington event. And we do have data. Okay, what we have is this. This is a pen chart, right? This is the data. If you try and go back to 1868, which is what we're going to do. So what you do is, it turns out there was a wonderful idea by Mayo that if you take, going back that far, you've got stations at Greenwich and you've got stations in Australia. Okay, so you've got 2. Remember, we have to get rid of this massive background. So having these 2 stations, you can get rid of the background. Okay, and this was the idea. So fine, we can get rid of the background, but of course we don't. We just have these pen charts, and quite often we don't really even have the pen chart. What you have is somebody every 3 hours would go to the observatory. They would hold up a piece of paper that was calibrated for that observatory that had logarithmic scoring on it. They would hold the paper up to the pen chart and give it a number, a kind of 1 to 9 number, and this is called K, the K index. So what you actually have most of the time is a number between 1 and 9 every 3 hours. And so what's happened is you take this number and you kind of reverse engineer it into something that looks like a measurement in nanotesla. So that's what's gone on, and that's what this AA index is. So it's terrible, but it's something. It's what we've got. Okay, I'm actually involved in BGS now. They have 250,000 of these images that they've scanned in going back, and we're going to try and use machine learning to try and read these things to try and get a better idea of what's going on. But you see the challenge, because the pen wraps round, it goes off the scale. Okay, so let's try and do this. And I'm going to try and say something about the Carrington event, but this even predates AA, so I don't even have an AA index for this guy, because it was only after the Carrington event people started to build the magnetometers. So all we've got is this one piece of data for the Carrington superstorm. What it is, by the way, okay, it's a measurement, and it was from then called Bombay, now Mumbai. Okay. The measurement was made, remember this is 1859, they had magnetized needles on threads over one side of the room, and you're over the other side of the room with a telescope watching the needles tilting. And that's what this is. And you can see they were taking these measurements, every few hours or so. Then they saw this huge event and they started taking loads and loads and loads of measurements because it was interesting. Okay, so that's what it is. And you can see it's huge. So why people get excited about the Carrington event, the end of the world, is this thing was 1600 nanoteslas, whereas those normal things are a few hundred. Normally it's a few hundred DST. This excursion is 1600, and that is why people are like the scary Carrington event, end of the world kind of discussions. How big was it really? Okay, this is just one magnetometer. Okay, so we want to say something about that. So I'd really like to know what the DST was for the Carrington event, and I don't know, but maybe I can get a clue from AA. So what I'm plotting here again are the rank order plots. So rank order plots, small to large, okay. And I've got 5 cycles of DST, and I'm plotting them here, rank order plots. So there's the quiet one again, the purple one, and then there's this kind of orange guy and so forth. And here is AA, and you can see how steppy it is, how discrete, because remember it's really these numbers between 1 and 9. It's not a proper measurement. It's really horrible, but nevertheless you can see that it kind of does what DST does. The purple one is down here, the orange one is here, the green one's at the top. So it does track DST, which it should do, but it's quite a horrible measurement. So we're going to have to come up with some way of characterizing it. You can't do all the lovely things you'd like to do with it, like you do with the proper time series. Oh, I'll do peak over threshold or whatever it is, these kinds of things. You can't do that because it's horrible. But so we thought we'll try something. Let's just look at the largest few records maybe in a year and average them, okay, to try and get an idea of what the biggest event was like in that year, something like that. Okay, so this is what's going on here. So I'm saying, okay, I'm going to compare the top. I'm going to take the top 0.5% of the AA records in a year, okay, and get their average, their annual average, non-overlapping annual averages, and I'm going to compare it with the maximum minus DST, so the biggest DST I got in that year for where I got DST, okay, and you can see they kind of follow each other. They're not perfect, okay, they follow each other, and so I can kind of stick a line through them with some error bars, okay. And then I can compare them in time. I can say, well, do they follow each other in time? And they more or less do, but not perfectly at all. So it's not perfect, but you know, the AA is kind of a proxy for this DST. And then I can immediately start counting. I can say, okay, I can now say, you know, people talk about great storms. Let's just say it's comparing sizes of events. Okay, so DST, you know, bigger excursion than 500 nanotesla. So this is like one of the top 5 storms or whatever that's happened, you know, in the past sort of 100 years. Really great storms. How often do you see those? And you see them in 4% of the last 150 years. So the last 150 years, each of those years, 4% of those years contained a great storm. Okay, then you can think about a severe storm. This is the sort of thing that will happen more often. Okay, 28% of those years saw a severe storm. And so now we're getting a much better solar cycle average because we've got 150 years worth of data. So, you know, 11, 12 cycles or what have you. Okay, so you can immediately start saying something like that. So I can convert from this AA to DST, and then I can compare things. And that's what's going on here, okay? So I've plotted, again, it's a rank order plot of the kind of biggest excursion you get in AA per year. So each of these little black dots is a year, okay? And this is the kind of DST you would have seen. And they're all kind of fitting on a nice line-ish, okay? So I can kind of draw a line through this and say, okay, they're following some kind of distribution, okay? And then I can read off of here, you know, how often did these things occur? And so I made a little, you know, I can list them in a little table, you know, which was the worst one. It was this famous 1921 storm, blah, blah, blah. The Quebec one turns out at number 5, okay, in case you'll be interested, I would have thought. Okay, and that comes in as a solar cycled average 3.3% chance per year based on this bit of analysis, okay, Quebec, compared with all the other ones. Okay, so this is solar cycle averaged, and we know I'm going to address that point next. Okay, but so at least we can sort of come up with some kind of numbers on this basis. Okay. Now, what about this Carrington event then? So this is quite a controversial thing. Okay, so people, you know, there are 2 ways of looking at this piece of data. That we've got this one piece of data for the Carrington event for the magnetic field. And you could say, well, look, it went down to, you know, 1760, which is a huge number. And that represents what DST would have done. Or you could say, well, no, hang on a minute. DST is this hourly average. So really, I should hourly average this thing. And also, it's only in one spot. And of course, you know, the effect on the Earth is very regional. So, you know, I'm not quite sure what this is. But if I just do the hourly average thing, I get something more like 850. They're very different numbers. So when people quote Carrington event probabilities, you've got to check which one of these numbers they're talking about, because they will use one or the other. Okay, so how does this compare with what I was just showing you? Well, here's my distribution of years. So, you know, these are rank orders. So what I can do is I can put what I've got starting at rank 2, 3, 4, whatever, and say, well, rank 1 is the one I haven't seen yet. Where is it? Okay, and that falls here. And there's an error bar because this is a theoretical error bar based on this distribution, the exponential distribution. You know that the rank 1 guy has a certain error bar, and I've put it on the plot. Okay, so if it was DS, and then I put DST, you know, 850 on there, and so you can see this estimate, the lower estimate, is part of this distribution of these guys, whereas this larger number, 1760, is way off. Okay, so they're telling you very different things. I can't tell you which one it is, by the way. This doesn't prove it's one or the other. It just tells you they're very different. And so what could be going on in the following, and it's got real implications for trying to get the risk of large events. Okay, it's the following idea. There's this famous idea by Lahire and Sornet's idea. He calls them Dragon Kings. I asked him, why do you call them Dragon Kings? Oh, because it sounds big and scary. That's honestly what he said. But the point is, they are way off the distribution of the celebrity heights. And here is an example from one of their papers. They're looking at the sizes of cities, okay, in France, French people. Okay, so, you know, Marseille, Lyon, whatever, they all lie on this kind of line. Okay, Paris is up here. Paris is off the chart. What does this tell you? Well, the things that determine the size of Paris are different to the things that determine the sizes of other cities, because Paris is a global city. I mean, Paris, New York, London, they form part of their own little distribution because, you know, they're global cities. And so that's why they don't fall on the distribution of the rest of them. And so this is the idea probably that's going on with the Carrington event. If the Carrington event is way off, it's telling you it's really different physics. Okay, so what that means, it means that if this guy is really off the chart here, I can't use the statistics that I learned from the AA index. I learned what the distribution looks like for yearly, you know, events, the largest event in a year essentially, and I learned that risk doesn't tell me anything about the likelihood of this guy if it's up here, if it's this Dragon King, but if it's this guy, it does. So it's kind of an important thing, and so the question is, well, how could you get up here? And there's been some discussion of this. Okay, one interesting thing was there was an event in 2012 which was huge, and it didn't hit the Earth, but it was observed. So we've got satellites looking at the sun, and there was a satellite, you know, out, you know, a distance, and it was observed. It didn't hit the Earth, and it was huge, and so it was modelled, and it was like, well, this could have been a Carrington if it hit the Earth. Okay, the reason it was huge is because it was a correlated extreme. You get the big CME, you can see the big coronal mass ejection coming for us here. Okay, so one coronal mass ejection swept out and it kind of cleaned out the solar wind, and the next one was really fast, and so the next one was really geoeffective. So that it's not one coronal mass ejection on its own, it's a correlated extreme, and so that's how it could be different physics. Here's another example. So again, this is what happened recently. We had lovely auroral displays, okay? And again, we saw the CME coming right for us. Here's the coronal mass ejection coming for us, okay, causing the nice auroral displays. There's a nice picture from my friends in Tromsø, okay? And we can model it. So what this is showing you here is a model. So what we've got here, there's the sun, and we've got satellites, stereo A, B, the Earth is in the middle. So we can check this. The thing you're looking at is a model, okay, but we can test it. And you can see what happens. You get one CME comes out, and then the second one comes and it catches up with them. And so people are talking about cannibal coronal mass ejections. The first one comes out, the second one catches up behind it and joins up with it and makes a bigger one. So correlated extremes, so different statistical behavior to the coronal mass ejections on their own. And so that may be what's going on. Okay. So finally, I wanted to do this solar cycle thing. Right, so there's a bit of detail here, but basically what's going on is there is a method. If you've got something that's vaguely oscillatory, there's a method of taking a non-uniform period, okay, and mapping it onto a uniform one, like on a clock. And so this is mapping the solar cycle time into solar cycle phase. So non-uniform cycling time and uniform in phase, okay. And we've done this, and what you get is a clock for the solar cycle. Here is a clock. So it takes 11 years to go around. Okay, I've managed to put all the cycles onto a uniform clock. And now I can put lots of data on it, and that's what we're doing here. So you can see the color bars are the occurrences of the flares of different sizes. The blue thing is basically radiation from the sun, solar corona. The black things are the the storms. So you take the AA index, and again, it's horrible, so I don't want to find a maximum, but I'll ask for its exceedance. When does it exceed 100, 200, 300, 400, 500? And I'll draw little stripes. So the big stripes, these stripes are all storms, big storms. And you can see it's quiet. There's a really nicely defined quiet interval, okay? And then it just jumps up and becomes really active. Okay, so the change looks like it's quite fast. This terminator, by the way, is called a terminator because it's the end of the cycle. One of the things that happens, the sunspots all do their thing. They form at kind of mid-latitudes, and then they come down to the center, to the equator, and they destroy each other, and that's the end of the solar cycle, and that's why it's called a terminator. The fun thing, which we don't understand, is if you just reflect that angle to that one, that's when the thing dies. Why? Okay, but the point is we know it's there. So we can get a nice clock for activity for the 11-year cycle of activity. And then I can unwrap the clock. This is unwrapping. So this is years. okay, and ask, well, when do things happen? And so here's the switch off, and then it switches on. So this area here I've marked in grey, okay, and so here are the flares, and so only 6% of the flares happen in this quiet period, okay. This is done again over 4 or 5 years. This is the AA index, so this is the 150-year data. There's only, if I look at the big storms, only 1.5 to 2%, 2.5% happen in the quiet period. So hardly any happen in the quiet periods. So this is actually quite useful for thinking, well, when are we going to get the big storms? Because we can figure when out this is in time. Okay, we know we're only very unlikely to see a big storm when it's quiet, not zero likelihood, but much lower likelihood. So if you turn it into a kind of return period for the large events, it changes it quite a lot for the quiet interval. And so that's something we can get out, which is quite useful. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is these are very sharp because, okay, we know they're there, but it's quite how sharp they are. And so the way we've accessed this is to say, well, okay, if the sun is fairly quiet, if it's quite quiet and ordered, you've just got like a couple of patches of activity and they're kind of spewing out stuff. So if you think of a garden sprinkler hose, you know, one of these things that rotates, it makes this kind of spirally pattern. And this is what happens. So the system, it just kind of makes these spirals. The sun's rotating away. It rotates every 27 days, 27-day recurrence, okay? So if you've got, if the solar wind is really ordered and stable, so less activity, you should see things happening every 27 days. And so we can look for that. Okay. And that's what we're going to look at. People have done this for years. They've been interested in this. And when they did it, they found that it shows a 22-year cycle. Why? The sun reverses its polarity every 11 years, up, down. Some reason it knows which way up its magnetic field is. So it's a bar magnet reversing and coming back again every 22 years. Okay. And that's called the Hale cycle. And so what we've done is taken this AA index again and now look for time structure by looking at autocovariance. So you look at the correlation between basically 27 days and the next 27 days. And I can then sum this over the cycle. So this is a 22-year clock now. And the thing to look at is the red guy. This is how ordered the solar wind is. So when it's quiet and ordered and a lot less active, this value is high. And when it's active and messy, it's low. And you can see it changes very sharply. Okay, I've got a limit on, you know, how finely time resolved I can get this because the autocovariance, you have to have a window. So it's the window length that's the problem. Okay, so if I look at activity with this, the dots are the same thing again. The big storms are these stripes. You can see here it's very active and then it suddenly switches off and the solar wind moves into a different state where it's quiet. And then it becomes very active again. And I'm showing it here, unpacking it in time. So this is active and this is quiet state, and it goes very quickly between the two. So these very sharp changes between one state and another, which we may be able to predict. So we're not only, this is the risk, this is the change in the risk from we're in active time, we're in quiet time. So that's something that could be quite useful, certainly for people planning operations and so forth. So I've tried to give a physics talk without giving a physics talk because I know you're not physicists, but to give you a feel for kind of where we've got good certain knowledge, where we can just calculate things and where there are issues. Okay, and so to summarize, individual space weather events, we can model them in exquisite detail. We're relying, though, on a few, as you've noticed, a few magnetometers, you know, and a model. So a few magnetometers, a very good model of ground conductivity, and then a very detailed model of a power grid or whatever, and you can, you know, look at the impact. We've very well instrumented around the Earth in images of what the sun is doing, but we still don't know when a flare is going to occur, and it's very hard to know whether it's going to hit or miss the Earth. And it's until it arrives, more or less, you don't know how geo-effective it's going to be because it depends on its magnetic field, and you can only measure that when it moves over your satellite that's sitting upstream. Okay, and so to put numbers on things, the high quality data is only a few solar cycles because it's since the space age. Okay, since we knew there was a radiation belts. Okay, and yet the solar cycles, no two solar cycles are the same, and we don't know what the next one's going to do, which is going to happen shortly. It's starting to happen. Historical data goes back much further, but it's not really a time series anymore. It's low quality data. And the other thing is, I've been talking about DST. If you want to know about risk and you go and look at the literature about, people putting numbers on the likelihood of events, they will all talk about DST. It's actually not a very good benchmark. It's just a convenient one, because you want the rate of change. Of course, you're interested in ground-induced currents. It's the rate of change you want. And people do model that. Some really nice papers on that. But the benchmark with the statistics is all based on DST. So it's something, but it's far from what you want to look at real detailed impact. And then this Carrington class event, which is the poster child that everybody will talk about. Either it's at the extreme of the observed distribution, it's an 850 event, and then we kind of know, it's 1 in 150 years or what have you. Or if it's a real biggie, so when people talk about the real big, estimates, actually we don't know what the likelihood is, because it's a different kind of physics. So we don't have statistics. So it's one or the other. And the final thing is that the variation with the solar cycle, it switches off really fast and switches on really fast. So we're really moving from really quite low risk time to really active high risk time very quickly. And so the hope is that we can pinpoint when these things will happen and maybe predict when you're going from one state to another. So I'll stop talking, because I was hoping people can ask questions. And don't think, gosh, I can't ask a physics question or whatever. Please ask. Okay.
Let's throw the floor open, and Alistair, you have your hand up. So let's go to Alistair, and then if other people have questions, please put your hand up and we'll come to you. Thank you.
So, Professor, first of all, I've always thought that I was the luckiest person in the world, because I love my job more than anybody else. And it's such a pleasure to hear somebody who loves their job as much as you. So thank you.
Yes.
The second comment is really around how familiar this feels. Because for a while I worked in a company where we did a lot of large risk underwriting.
Yeah.
And so there would be a loss.
Yeah.
But in the history, there'd only been the one.
Yeah.
And so the question of, should I be pricing as if that was normal, or should I be pricing like that was a freak and will never happen again, feels very similar to the type of analysis you're trying to do here about how to think about that one data point from Mumbai. So, but my practical question is, if you were making the underwriting decision as to whether or not it was 850 or 1760. Was Carrington as big as some people think, or not? What would your sophisticated, informed underwriting decision be? Because it has a lot to do with how we should be thinking about how big this tail risk is.
Yeah, I would go with, and bear in mind, every time I give this talk or even publish a paper on this, I get the two views, okay? So I get both, which, so people think it's very, split. I'm going to go for the 850. And I think the reason is, as I say, this is not based on a full understanding. This is something I'm very actively working on. It's just that, the idea was that you'd have some special physics to make this big number, this correlated extreme thing. But actually, you see this correlated extreme thing popping up quite a lot. And thinking back on the way I constructed this particular metric, this AA thing, I was saying, well, I didn't ask for the events. I didn't ask for individual events, because I don't think you can. I said, tell me about the top 0.5%. And I think that picks out these correlated guys. So I think we kind of, they're in there. I think they're in there. So my guess is that actually it's the 850, and that's all that actually happens. I don't know that for sure, though, because to check that is extremely difficult. And we'd have to actually go back and know what the solar wind was doing for all those events, and you don't have the data. So I'm actively trying to think about how one could nail that down more. But I think I don't think the world's going to end. But which would be 1760. This is really, it would be the world ending. It would take out your power grid completely if it was this really big guy. But I don't think it's that. But never mind, 850 is challenging, But that's what I think, and that's the reason. I think the particular metric that I chose picks out it picks the largest event in the year. So it's kind of doing that, but it's tricky.
Super interesting, and I thought from your nice fitted chart that was likely how you were going to call it. But,
yes.
That was fascinating to hear your thought process. Ian, can I just
please
pile on? So what is the next scientific step that is required so that we can better predict whether the next solar cycle is going to be large or small.
Oh my goodness. Well, I mean, predicting the size of the solar cycle, it's an industry. If you look out there, you'll find there are many papers, people trying to do this. I think if we can, there's something in this. Again, this is very new stuff. So there's something in this clock idea that because we have relationships like the length of the previous cycle correlates with the size of the next one. Okay, so if we can more accurately say what that means when we say the length of the previous cycle, and in the past people have just taken the minimum sunspot number, they just all agreed when the minimum was. Okay, but this kind of the idea of the clock, it's the changes are very fast, so it may be that there's a lot better way we can nail down that kind of relationship. I mean, there is some relationship, and that may, because then you've got you have to be able to say what the length of the last cycle was, so you have to know when the cycle's ended in order to talk about the next one. And so that's the other part. I showed this clock. You have to predict off the end of the clock. You have to extrapolate off the end and say, okay, this is when this cycle is going to end, and so now I know how long it's been, and so now I can say, well, how big the next one's going to be. We've tried this and it's actually really tricky. So, but that's kind of around that kind of stuff we could do something. But as I say, there's a lot of literature and people do detailed models to try and understand how the sun is working, you know, and why, you know, it's a really interesting problem. You know, you've got this thing, the sun, I mean, the size of the sun flipping its magnetic field, you know, every 11 years or so, but not exactly. And how it does that and what and how it's a chaotic oscillator basically. And we don't have many cycles. So there's a lot of work people trying to understand this. But I think, you know, there may be scope for getting this out, and it's active area of research.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah.
So we're entering a new cycle, and most of the activity from your charts occurs in the middle of the cycle. Is it safe to say most of the activity is going to be the end of this decade, the
No.
solar storms that we're likely to see?
No, I don't think so. I'm not saying it's. Let me just quickly flip. If you still got my screen, you should have hopefully. You know, it switches. I don't think it's true to say it all happens at maximum. It just switches on and off. So the really big storms, you know, there's hardly anything happening in this kind of quiet period, and then they kind of switch on. These are big events. So I don't think it's true to say it just kind of happens in the middle, the maximum. You know, and the switch on is probably sort of soon nowish. I mean, it's still, you know, that's still something. It's hard to say, but you know. So yeah, that's my takeaway from this. It's not that if you're far from maximum that you don't have to worry. It's that you've got a nice quiet period when you don't have to worry, and then it switches on, and then suddenly you get these big events. I mean, you can see from this plot that right after the switch on, we've seen, you know, these are really large. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is a 600, you know, AA event. So, you know, this is a big one, and that was right after switch on. So again, in the literature, you'll find lots of people will say, oh, you can have a big storm even when it's quiet. And I've actually gone and looked back at these things, and a lot of times they're actually sort of here or they're here. So in other words, it's switched on. So it's not that things can happen at any time in this quiet interval. They can just happen right at the edge. Suddenly you can get big events immediately. It's not true that you get kind of small events, and as the cycle gets going, they get bigger and bigger, and then they get smaller and smaller again. That's not what's happening.
Okay. For everyone out there, you will get a copy of the slides, so you'll have more time to go through and really read for contents. In the meantime, are there any other questions for Dr. Chapman?
There's a question in the chat, Ian.
There is. Okay, so let's open up my chat. Is there value in observing sun-like stars and their flares and CMEs?
Yes, and again, yes, it's really interesting. There are some really nice plots now that are emerging about stars where you can look at how their rotation period correlates with whether or not they're flaring. So you can kind of, you know, get a feel for, you know, where the sun is in relative to other stars to try and understand the dynamo. So again, they're tricky measurements to do, and you don't have measurements over lots of, you know, stellar cycles, but you do have flaring rates, and you do have the sort of rotation periods. So there's some really nice stuff coming out of that.
Thank you. And that question was from Dr. Durand. He was one of our speakers on October 20th. So another colleague of yours. Other questions or comments out there? I should have included a trigger warning that this session is likely to make you remember your grade 11 physics mark. And I think I'm going to be depressed the rest of the day.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I try not to do too much physics. Just
Are there any other questions or comments? It is 2:58, so we're actually finishing a couple of minutes early, and that is good. That will give people a chance. We'll give another 2-minute break between our next session. So Dr. Chapman, thank you very much. Very, very fascinating talk. And we're getting insight into developing science, and we always try to bring in subject matter experts talking about emerging risk issues, and I think we've done both in this one session. So thank you very much for joining us today, and you're certainly welcome
Thank you for
to
inviting me.
sit in for the rest of the session, but we'll bid you thanks and I guess good evening.
Thank you.
It's later in the evening in the UK, and thanks for being online with us.